Musical Talk, the UK independent musical theatre podcast.
So welcome, listeners, to another episode of Musical Talk. We've got a very special guest today, but before we start, I do have a little disclaimer. This episode will be about not should we say a rather controversial musical that may shock you. So if you are easily offended, whatever you do, do not watch the Rocky Horror Show. We've got a very special guest with us today because we are celebrating this year 50 years of the Rocky Horror Show. And I have with you an absolute master on the subject, a wonderful human being. Please welcome Robert Bagnall. How are you, mate?
I'm very well, thank you. What a build-up.
It's lovely to speak to you and hear your voice again. It's been far too long, my friend. So let me just introduce Rob. Is Rob or Robert? Which would you prefer?
I prefer Rob.
Rob, okay, I'll call you Rob. I don't know because usually, just the listeners at home, I usually call him Baggers. So I just thought I'd check which you were more happy with.
I'll answer to whatever, mate. But Robert's my preferred.
Brilliant. So we worked together. First time we worked together was back to what, 2018, something like that. I think it was 2017.
Yeah, I guess so. It must have been. Yeah, it was
around there. And I
feel like I've known you longer than that. I do feel like I've known you longer, but it was 2018, I think. Yeah,
2018. And we have done Panto together. You've been a baddie, and I was the hero for a change. It was fun, wasn't it? You were a very nasty pirate. So for those of you that may be wondering, we worked together at the fabulous Alton Towers theme park resort, where we were both entertainers. And how long have you now been there, Rob? Just out of interest.
Alton Towers, I believe this is my 37th season. 37 summer seasons and most winters as well. So
that's absolutely fantastic. Just love it.
Most of my working life.
And when I first met you, you were wearing a Rocky Horror T-shirt, and I remember coming up to you and going, "Oh, do you like the Rocky Horror Show?" Then that was an understatement.
Said, "No, don't ask him that."
So you are, I would say, you are like a super fan. Is that right? Would that be fair to say?
That if that term is a term, then yes, I would say so. Yeah.
And you have literally, what I always say, you literally wrote the book, but of course that was Richard O'Brien that wrote the book.
Yes, it was.
But you have written a book. Is this how many editions of the book have you written now?
The original was for the 40th anniversary of the show, which was 2013, and it was Still the Beast is Feeding, 40 Years of Rocky Horror. Then the print on demand version was 2 years after that. So we have now updated the book. It's revised, updated, and expanded. 50 years of Rocky Horror.
50 years of Rocky Horror, and it's called Still the Beast is Feeding.
Still the Beast is Feeding. 50 years of Rocky Horror. Revised, updated, and expanded.
What a wonderful title. So we'll spend the podcast talking. Obviously, this is a Rocky Horror special. So really, I think we should start at the beginning. And I really don't know much about the origins or the beginnings of Rocky Horror. So, Rob, if you'd like to take us through it, how did it begin? Where did it begin? And most importantly, why did it begin?
It began in 1973. Richard O'Brien had grown up in New Zealand. He was born in England. He grew up in New Zealand, and he came back over to London, and he was a jobbing actor. He got a part in Jesus Christ Superstar, the original London production, as part of the chorus, and he was going to be he was going to be promoted, as it were, to the role of Herod, but he played it for one performance, and Robert Stigwood was producing, and he didn't like the way he played it. So they basically let him go basically and paid him off. And while he was out of work, he thought, I'd like to see a rock and roll musical. And he'd grown up watching B movies, and he was into rock and roll. He was into Elvis and all the 50s rock and roll because that's what he'd grown up with. He loved all the old science fiction movies, all the black and white B movies and the Hammer horror things. And he thought, I'd love to see all of that together. Muscle Man adverts out of the old comics, which he used to read. and he got a gig working for EMI's Christmas party. And his wife at the time, then Kimmy Wong, said, "Well, why don't you write a song based on all these B movies that you love?" And he came up with Science Fiction Double Feature, and he played the song at this EMI Christmas party, and the song was a hit, and everybody liked it. And subsequently, he was hired by Jim Sharman, the director of Jesus Christ Superstar, to do a play at the Royal Court Theatre. And during this time, he said to Jim Sharman, I'm writing a musical." And Jim Sharman's comment was, "Oh, I hope it's not religious," because at the time it was all Superstar and Godspell and all those sort of biblical rock musicals. And he played him Science Fiction Double Feature, and it really piqued his interest. And he thought, "Oh, we could do something with this." So then Jim Sharman was asked again to direct a play in the main house at the Royal Court. And he said, "Well, can we have a bit of fun over the summer in the theatre upstairs, which is the attic theatre above the Royal Court, which is 63 seats, a tiny little space, for just 3 weeks." And they put this little show together. When it was being written with the working title, "They Came from Denton High," because it was a B movie type of title.
Right.
And just before it went on, it became the Rocky Horror Show, and it was a massive hit for 3 weeks, sold out performances. So they extended it to 5 weeks, after which Richard thought, "That's it now. That's the end of this little quirky little bit of entertainment. Anybody who wants to see that sort of thing will have seen it." But because it was so popular, it then transferred up the King's Road to a theatre, the Classic, Chelsea, which was a tiny cinema which was scheduled for demolition, which got converted into a live theatre for this show. Then that theatre was demolished, and it moved to the Isolde, which was later renamed the King's Road Theatre, and ended up running there for 6 years before it got transferred to the Comedy Theatre in London for another year. So eventually this 3-week show ran for 7 years in London.
It's just incredible, isn't it? And what is the appeal? I mean, you kind of summed it up perfectly there about the B movies and the and the music, and how it sort of came to be in his imagination. But what makes what is its appeal? Would you say to the audience? Why is it so endearing to the people? Well, everyone. I mean, there aren't many people that haven't seen it. Let's face it.
Yeah.
And if you haven't seen it, if you're listening to the podcast, you must go and watch it.
My own interest was mainly through the B movies, because I used to watch all these B movies on TV with my dad when I was little, and even at like age 7, I stayed up and watched King Kong and The Day the Earth Stood Still and Tarantula, and all these songs are mentioned in all these films are mentioned in the opening song. So that genre of film was something I grew up with. My mum would always be playing the rock and roll music and Buddy Holly and the Everly Brothers and Elvis and things like that, so that was the music I grew up with. So I love that. So all of those things, I couldn't believe when I saw it that there was one single piece of entertainment that had brought all these things together that I loved. And I think it just struck a chord at the time, because obviously at the time it was just as they always say that the whole lyric, like "Let's do the time warp again," summed up the jump from the 50s and the 50s family values and the sort of pre-pill couple of Brad and Janet moving into the world of Frankenfurter, which was the glam rock sort of bisexuality world of the early 70s, which Bowie was doing, and T-Rex and all those sort of glam rockers were doing. So it made that leap from the 50s values into the 70s values. But then punk came in towards the end of the 70s, and it kind of fitted in with that as well. And I discovered it in the 80s. And there was, by the 80s, you'd got the goth scene and you'd got the new romantic scene, and it still stayed kind of relevant because of the outrageousness of it and the campness of it. However, one thing we need to mention is the audience participation side of it.
Yeah, I was getting into that.
That didn't exist when the show first opened.
Right.
It was a little musical. It was very, very clever. It struck a chord, and I always think it's one of those things where on the surface, it's very sort of trivial and superficial and just a bit of fun. But if you look into it, there are mythological motifs and Shakespearean motifs and all this sort of really it sounds quite pretentious, but it is in there. But
Yeah.
whereas a lot of things do that the other way around, and they'll say, "Look how clever we're being." Rocky never did that. Rocky just
Yeah.
said, "We're a bit of fun. This is a bit of camp fun with great songs and fun characters." And then as soon as you start to look into it deeper, you think, "Ah, there's more going on here.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on." And Richard always said it was a root fairy tale. It's basically Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Brad
Right.
and Janet are Adam and Eve. Frankenfurter's the serpent. It's that whole forbidden fruit thing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Temptation. Yeah, I understand.
Babes in the Wood meets the old dark house, Richard
Yeah.
O'Brien, which
I
which
yeah.
is all covered in the book.
Yeah. I always
Yeah,
think of them as like Greek god characters because in the
yeah,
Greek mythology, all of the Greeks
mm,
are kind of flawed as well as being sort of,
that's right. Yeah,
gods. They're kind of flawed. And that's what I kind of saw the flaws in everyone's characters are highlighted
yeah,
in the show as well as, like Janet's a great example. I know we
yeah.
spoke at length about Janet, the character. And I believe she's your favorite, is she not? Is that
If
right?
I have to, yeah, I mean, I love every character, but if someone says who's your favorite character, I usually pick Janet because I think her journey is very, very interesting. It's
Yeah.
never. I mean, you get the people will think it's just this sort of goody goody girl, a bit like Sandy in Greece, and then at the end she totally changes and becomes this man eater. And Janet, I don't think Janet is like that. I think it's always there with Janet. She's this repressed 50s girl who's been brought up to behave a certain way,
Yeah.
but wants to express herself. And Frankenfurter doesn't change her, he brings it out of her. He brings that out. That's already there, and he brings that out.
That's so
And Brad,
interesting. Yeah. I remember us having this
sorry, Brad's kind of the other way around. Brad is this repressed sort of 50s male, and
Yeah.
because he has these experiences which he actually enjoys, he's a little bit ashamed of enjoying it because he's got the 50s the 50s thing instilled in him, and he's like, "Oh, but I shouldn't be enjoying this because I'm a man and I'm the hunter gatherer." And
Yeah.
Janet becomes liberated because of it, and she becomes the stronger character.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's just, yeah, it's interesting. Again, I just love conversing with you about this subject. It's such a fascinating script, such a fascinating story. And again, you just scratch the surface, and there's so much more underneath. Let's get on to the audience participation
Yeah.
because I obviously, whoever goes to watch it, a lot of people will see the audience dressing up, putting the makeup on, and also joining in with the show quite a lot. Bringing the props along and doing the shout outs, the classic shout outs, and then trying to make up their own very clever ones.
Mm.
I'll ask you a very blunt question. Does that get on your nerves?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Okay.
Sometimes it does. It's become part of the show now, and the show often gets marketed that way. And I genuinely do think that is one of the reasons it's still so big and why it's still popular.
Yeah.
People dress up and they go to the show and they know they can shout out. The way that started was 2 years after the show opened, they made a film with 20th Century Fox, the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Never heard
And
of it.
it's a great film, but it died a death when it came out because this was 1975. They had no idea how to market it, no idea how to exhibit it, and it was an embarrassment to Fox. They didn't know what to do with it. And a new executive working at Fox, a guy called Tim Deegan, was given this film basically as here, try and do something with this. This is an embarrassment. See if you can do something to promote it. And obviously, it was the mid-70s. There was no video back then. There was very little chance for a film to be seen on television or, obviously, of course, video. And one idea he had was to run it on the midnight circuit, which they used to call the werewolf circuit. And they'd show these really sort of weird, grungy little films like Night of the Living Dead was one, and
Oh, I love
John Waters' Pink Flamingos, all those sort of films, and
Yeah.
Browning's Freaks and stuff like that. And they were shown at midnight. And so the audience they drew in were people who were insomniacs, or they were drinking, or they were just had nowhere else to go. And these people would come back and see it again. And Lou Adler, the American producer, contacted one of these cinemas that had got this late night showing of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And he said, "Well, how's it doing?" And they said, "Oh, we see maybe 500 people, and we're getting 50 a week in, 49 one week, 50 the next week." And they said, "Oh, that's a bit disappointing. But who are they? What's the demographic? Who are these people? Are they students? Are they older people? Are they young? Who are they? Who are they?" And they went, "Oh no, it's exactly the same people every week come back."
That's
That's
amazing.
interesting. Well, yeah, it's week after week. It's exactly the same 50 people will be in again, and because those people got to know the film, and maybe they were a little bit bored with it, but they got to know where the gaps were in the lines. So one night, Janet would put the newspaper over her head, and somebody in the audience would shout, "Buy an umbrella, you cheap whatever," you know.
Yeah.
And so then the narrator would say, "I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey," and somebody shouted, "How strange was it?" But then the following week, everyone would be shouting it. So
Yeah.
they started coming up with lines to shout themselves back to the film, which then evolved into people dressing up as the characters, throwing rice for the wedding, squirting
Yeah.
water pistols for the rain.
Yeah.
Once the revivals of the stage show started, sort of late 70s, early 80s, they released the soundtrack album of the film, which was the audience participation album, with the full soundtrack of the film, including dialogue, with the audience as well at a cinema in New York.
Oh, wow.
That was available as an import all around the world. So people who'd heard this record then knew the things to shout. So they then began shouting them at the live stage show.
That's so interesting. That's
And
amazing.
it became part of that as well. And in the 80s, it was absolutely crazy. It really was the rice being thrown at the wedding. And when Frankenfurter says paradise is to be mine, they throw bounty bars onto the stage. And suddenly you get a break and they throw Kit Kats. And it was absolutely insane, to the point where the stage was getting covered in water and there was rice being thrown on the stage, that they had to stop it all, which is why you're not allowed to take props into the show anymore, because
Right.
it was dangerous. It was dangerous for the actors. It was dangerous for the electrical equipment, and the theaters were getting trashed.
Of course. Yeah.
That was all part of it. So they toned it down quite a lot, but the verbal participation is still there. And on a good
Yeah.
night, if it's clever and you've got the hardcore fans and all the people who know the lines, and they'll shout these lines back and forth. And as you say, they'll come up with clever ones of their own to stick in.
Yeah.
But once you get to the interval, the people who didn't know about that will go off into the bar, have a drink, think, "Oh, we can shout stuff out." But
Yeah.
they don't know the things to shout. So they're just
Yeah.
shouting out everything. And the ending of the show, in my opinion, is really very poignant. It's really quite sort of dark and sad and poignant. The real sort of hardcore fan base have a bit of an unwritten rule that we stop shouting out for those last few scenes.
That's during the floor show onwards.
Yeah, from the floor show onwards, from the floor show until the end, we don't shout. But not everyone, of course, knows that, and you can't be parental, and you can't say, "No, you don't shout out from here." So if people are shouting out, they're shouting out. But that's when it can spoil the show, because the show,
Yeah.
I cry at the end of King Kong, I cry at the end of all these films, I can cry at the end of the Rocky Horror Show, because the way that it finishes is really quite emotional if it's directed right and it's played right.
Yeah.
But people who are just drunk shouting out everything don't care about that, and it is funny, and the things they shout is funny, and you can't tell them not to. But I love to get lost in it, and I love that really poignant ending, because it can get me every time if it's done properly.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that's such an interesting answer. Yeah, because I remember going to see it, and a friend of ours shouting out to the people saying, "Don't shout out! Stop it now!"
Yeah.
And it was that's why I asked you the question, because I saw that happening. I didn't know the rule. I didn't know, because I never joined in.
It's not a rule. It's just one of these things that the people who really genuinely love the show itself will still shout out, and I shout out. I mean, I'll be shouting out all the lines, and it'll go down well. You feel great when it gets a laugh and it gets a round of applause, and you feel really good. And if you make the cast corpse every now and again, it's really funny. But it's just
sorry, come on.
It's just we've tended over the years, those who go and see it 100, 200, 500 times, whatever, kind of think, "Oh, it gets serious from this point on," and it isn't. It's not Blood Brothers and it's not Phantom, but it can be. It can be.
That's fair enough. No, that's absolutely fair enough. So what was I going to ask you? Oh, now I have to ask you about your collection of Rocky Horror memorabilia. This is what I really wanted, just to get a scope of the amount of things that you own that are Rocky Horror. I mean, the things that I saw you collect when I was working with you, and I've only known you for 5 or 6 years. We can't decide which, but the things that you would buy, and that is just incredible. I mean, how many things do you think you own Rocky Horror related in a ballpark?
It's definitely thousands, because I've got programs from all over the world and brochures from all over the world, cast recordings, at least 30 or 40 different cast recordings on CD alone. Wow. Also on vinyl. Any that I can find, I will buy on every format. So if I can get the same one on vinyl, cassette, I've got the soundtrack on 8-track. I've got the Super 8 version of the film, the Betamax version of the film, and if I find a copy that's exactly the same video or the same DVD, but it's a non-UK one, so it's got the international cover, or it's got a different language on it, I'll buy it again. So I've got shelves that are just the Rocky Horror Picture Show VHS from different countries, and every time it's released, I'll buy it again just because the cover's different.
Yeah.
Programs, posters, the soundtracks and the cast recordings are probably my favorite things.
Yeah.
But you know, the usual mugs and all these sort of things, the souvenir mugs and key rings and badges and T-shirts that they sell at all the shows, I'll always have to get them. And when
of course, your book is sold at the theatre as well. Let's not forget.
It was, yeah. I don't know if they still sell it, but they definitely sold the first edition of it. Yeah,
that was a great story.
The first time I saw it, which was a really surreal and proud moment, because we hadn't received our copies from the publisher yet, and I went to see the show at the Regent in Stoke in Hanley, and my book was on sale. myself and my friend Phil Barden co-authored the book. He saw the show in the King's Road back in the 70s, so he'd seen it probably 10 years before I did. Probably more, 10 or 11 years before I did. And he used to put stories about memories of his time seeing the show in the King's Road onto the fan club forums on the website and things. And I lapped it up. I really got into it because I'd never seen it pre-audience participation. I'd never seen it pre-80s. And he'd begun searching for old cast members just to interview, just out of interest. And I said, I've always wanted to see a book that tells the whole history of the show, because there already were books, but they usually focused on the film, or if they did focus on the show, they'd do the first few years, the opening of the show, then the film, and then they kind of just say, oh, and yes, and then it still carried on until today. And I thought, yeah, but it still evolved, and the way it was watched and the way it was enjoyed evolved and continued to change. There's more to that story. And he said, well, why didn't you write that yourself? I said, oh no, I couldn't do it myself. Oh no, I couldn't do it justice. And he kept doing these interviews, and then one day someone had put on the fan club, the fan club sort of chats and things, when are we going to see these interviews? And he said, oh, I'm saving those for a project I'm working on with Rob. And I was like, oh, right, okay. And then he started looking for publishers, and he started doing more interviews. So he did a lot of research. I did a lot of research, and he did all the legwork looking for publishers, and I actually wrote the text. So I actually did the writing, but we're co-authors. We're both named authors.
No, it's absolutely fantastic, and what a wonderful thing to do. I mean, we've all had a fantasy of writing our own book, but the fact that you've done it is just fantastic, and such a wonderful subject as well. Because we all like to geek out to musicals. That's why we're listening, and that's why we do the podcast. But the level of your knowledge of this show is just insane. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you about it, because I just sit there, I just wind you up and let you go. And it's so much fun just to talk about how passionate you are. I do want to ask, because I'm a huge Meatloaf fan.
Yes.
How did he get involved with the project? I mean, how did that happen?
Meatloaf. I'm a massive Meatloaf fan, and I've been a fan of. I think I was about 10 when Bat Out of Hell came out, and although he'd already done Rocky Horror, I wasn't aware of it at the time. So I was actually a Meatloaf fan before I was a Rocky fan. Meatloaf was in, I think, a lot of the sort of Rocky cast members from the 70s were in Hair at one point, a production, because obviously Hair was a massive musical at the time. Sort of groundbreaking at the time. So with the UK cast of Hair, Tim Curry had been in it, and Richard O'Brien had been in it, and a lot of the other people. And I think Meatloaf had done Hair in the US, and they were bringing this musical over from London, which they didn't really know about, to LA, to the Roxy in LA, which was Lou Adler's theatre, because Lou Adler had struck the deal for the American rights, having seen the show in London. And Meatloaf auditioned for the US cast and was cast in the LA production. He always used to tell a story where he didn't know really what the show was. They didn't know much about it. Tim Curry was obviously doing the London production, but then got brought over to do the American production and subsequently the film. So Meatloaf said we were all in this little rehearsal room, and we've been doing these little songs like science fiction and Over at the Frankenstein Place and all these things. He said, but nobody really knew what it was, and we had no idea what it was. And Tim Curry arrived, and Jim Sharman, again the director, said to Tim, I think the best thing for you to do is just perform Sweet Transvestite for them, because that's Frank's opening number, and that'll just give them an idea of what it is.
Yeah.
So Tim said, I rolled up my trousers, I put these fishnets on and did the makeup and everything. He said, and he came out and he's singing, I'm just a sweet transvestite. And Meatloaf said, I looked at him, I thought, what the hell is this? He said, I'm not doing a show. I'm not doing a drag show. I'm not doing a show where a guy's in fishnet stockings. I'm not doing it. And he left the building and he just stormed out. And there's a guy called Graham Jarvis was playing the narrator, and he followed him out and he said, you can't just walk out on these people. You've got to listen to them. You've got to listen to what it is. Come back. He said, because we hadn't had a script yet. We'd only been putting these songs on, getting them on their feet. We didn't really know the story. He said, so he persuaded me to walk back in, because he said, I got a ticket for jaywalking. I was that angry, I stormed out. He said, he brought me back in, and he said, and we started to talk about it. And he said, and in the stage show, Meatloaf played Eddie, but the actor who plays Eddie normally plays Dr. Scott as well, who is the professor who is Eddie's uncle. In the film, it was two different people. But at the end of the show, spoiler alert, Dr. Scott ends up in the fishnets as well. And Meatloaf said, I read this and I went, I'm not doing this. He said, I'm not putting fishnets on. I'm not doing drag, because he was Texan boy, he was.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I'm not doing a drag show. I'm not wearing fishnets. And he said, I will always go for the laugh. He said, if I can get the laugh, I'll always go for the laugh. And he said, and eventually I get fitted for these massive fishnet stockings. And he says, and when I pulled out of the blanket and my leg went up and I got the fishnets on, he said, that is probably the biggest laugh I have ever heard in theatre. He said, and that was how I sort of got into it. And he championed it for them for the rest of his life. He was always one of those who championed Rocky and stuck up for Rocky. And he then also got the part of Eddie in the film. But Jonathan Adams, who was the original narrator on stage in London, played Dr. Scott in the film. So Meatloaf only played Eddie, but Meatloaf was larger than life in every way.
Oh, brilliant.
He was perfect for it, and he became synonymous with it because of that.
Yeah, I'm literally seeing him in my mind's eye right now. As soon as you mentioned it in the film, I can literally see him doing it. It's like, he's only on the screen for a matter of minutes, but you do not forget that performance.
No, and you can't miss. And it's a cracking number as well. It's an absolute. I mean, every song in Rocky is a banger, but that is a banger. He comes out of the freezer, sings this amazing song, and then he just gets hacked to pieces. And you never forget him. You never forget him. I mean, rest in peace. We met him at London Film and Comic Con in 2018, and he was the nicest guy. He was such a great guy.
Lovely, because I mean that was what I was going to say as well. You've met so many of the cast members. I'm lucky enough to be a Facebook friend of yours, and over the last few weeks, it's been a pleasure to follow you, because you've just been 50th Rocky Horror like mad, and it's just been all over the King's Road, all over Chelsea, all the original places, and the pictures of the original cast that you've got. It's like with it's incredible to see the lengths you will go to for your collection, your passion, and it really comes through. And I think it's a really wonderful thing to talk about with you, because you are so passionate but so genuinely excited every time we have a conversation about it. And I've noticed that ever since I've met you, and I just think it's a wonderful thing. And I mean, if someone hasn't seen the show, what would you say to them? Not just go and see it.
Go and enjoy it. I think some of the things people worry about are they hear about the dressing up, so they think, oh, do you have to dress up? No, you don't. Wear what you're comfortable with. Just go and enjoy the show. And don't worry about the things you have to shout out either, because obviously since the dawn of the internet and social media, people are always like, oh, what are the things we shout? Is there a script for the audience? It's so much better. I went into it not knowing any of those things. I went to see the show. I fell in love with it from Science Fiction Double Feature, because that song just spoke to me, because it mentions all those films I loved as a child. So it was a perfect opening song. But then the audience starts shouting out these things, and I was howling with laughter at them shouting back to the narrator, and because I didn't know any of the things to shout out. And then I started to pick some of them up. And when I went to see it again, I started being brave enough to shout some of the things out. When people say to me, what are the things to shout out? I say, please don't worry about that. Just go and enjoy it.
Yeah.
Wear what you like, enjoy the show, and
Yeah.
just enjoy it. Don't worry about what you shout and things, because it's just so much more fun if you just sit there and don't know anything about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's absolutely wonderful. Well, I think we have to wrap it up now. Obviously, we've only scratched the surface of your knowledge, and listeners, I can promise you that because as I say, I've known Rob for a long time, and his knowledge and his passion is absolutely wonderful. So, if you want to read more about this, I think we know what we can do, don't we, Rob? What can we do?
Quite a lot more. It's in the book. Still the Beast is Feeding 50 Years of Rocky Horror, and it is available from Telos Publishing, which is www.telos.co.uk, and it is on Amazon now as well.
Lovely. So yeah, you can go on that famous website, which we can mention. It's not the BBC. I can say Amazon, but I like to say that famous website that's a Rainforest as well. You can get next day delivery of Still the Beast is Feeding. So, Mr. Rob Bagnall, oh, I got tongue tied then. Thank you so much for joining us, and I know all our listeners will thank you as well. We'll try and get some pictures of a bit of your collection as well to put on our Twitter account if that's okay. I think, and obviously the front cover of the book, so people know what they're looking for. So do check our Twitter account this week, and we will put some links up on our website as well. Rob, it's been an absolute pleasure. Guys, I hope you enjoyed listening to that podcast, and we will see you again very soon. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Musical Talk. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk, you can visit our website at musicaltalk.co.uk, where you'll find all our episodes, or you can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Musical Talk.